The air in the UN General Assembly Hall was unnaturally still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. Every seat was taken, every eye watching the stage where two men, polar opposites in both ideology and legacy, were about to speak. On one side stood Benjamin Netanyahu, the long-standing Israeli Prime Minister, his face carved from decades of war and diplomacy. On the other side stood Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the defiant leader of Burkina Faso, whose meteoric rise had disrupted power equations from Paris to Washington. Netanyahu adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and delivered his statement with razor-sharp intent. The ceasefire was a mistake. We decide peace or war, and we've chosen war. Gasps erupted. Some delegates shifted nervously in their seats. The representatives of Turkey and Qatar walked out in protest. For a moment, the room was chaos. But then Traoré stood. He didn't slam the podium. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he walked with calm precision to the microphone and stared directly into Netanyahu's eyes. His voice, when it came, was low but carried across the hall like thunder waiting to strike. Then drown in the blood you spilled. Silence fell like a hammer. His words cut through the air, through decades of sanitized speeches and diplomatic theater. This was no polished diplomat. This was a soldier, a survivor. A storm wrapped in calm. He turned not to the cameras, not to the delegates, but to the people of Gaza, West Africa, and every colonized land who watched from behind screens and wire fences. You broke every truce, killed every chance. Now you think war is yours to declare? He paused. War is already here, and it remembers. At that moment, the chamber changed. It wasn't just a hall of nations anymore, it became a battlefield of conscience. This wasn't just about Palestine. It was about every place where the powerful had crushed the weak, every lie buried under security, and every child buried under rubble. And Captain Traoré had just drawn the line. Netanyahu didn't flinch. But his eyes twitched, just slightly, as Traoré's words echoed through the room. The Israeli Prime Minister leaned into the microphone, his voice sharpened by decades of warfare and statecraft. We will defend our people, he declared, pausing for effect. With or without your approval. Traoré didn't respond. He didn't have to. The ripple of murmurs that moved through the hall had already answered for him. Delegates whispered in French, Arabic, Swahili, and English. Some sat rigid, others looked away, ashamed, perhaps, or unwilling to admit what they saw. This wasn't defense. This was domination. News screens worldwide lit up with breaking headlines. Footage played on loop, burned out hospitals, children screaming under rubble, fathers digging graves with bare hands. Netanyahu had just shattered the illusion of restraint. Backstage, advisors scrambled. Western diplomats looked panicked. The U.S. ambassador's smile faltered as she leaned toward her mic. Let's remain constructive. But Traoré raised his hand. One single gesture, and the room obeyed. He took a step forward, his uniform dark against the marble backdrop, and lifted a folded piece of paper. Slowly, he unfolded it, revealing a grainy photograph. Rafah border crossing. Bombed. Civilians scattered. Aid trucks turned to ash. This, he said, is what you call defense? He turned to the crowd. Israel ends ceasefires with bombs. And when the world gasps, it calls it justice. But justice does not scream from the mouths of drones. It does not hide behind iron walls while children die in UN shelters. Some delegates clapped. Others hesitated, trapped between alliances and reality. But something had changed. The performance was over. The masks were slipping. I've seen war, Traoré continued, his voice rising now. I've held the bodies of my people. I've buried my brothers. But never, not once, did I call it peace. He looked directly at Netanyahu. So don't speak to me of defense. Speak to your own reflection, if you can still face it. And for the first time that day, Netanyahu said nothing. The cameras panned across the room, delegates staring at the floor, others silently nodding. Outside, crowds in Istanbul, Dakar, Jakarta, and even New York had gathered, chanting a name they hadn't heard before this war, Traoré. Traoré. The battlefield wasn't just in Gaza. It was here, in this room. And Traoré had just turned the tide. The UN chamber sat in thick, suffocating quiet. The kind that doesn't beg for answers, it demands them. Traoré folded the photo and placed it back in his jacket like a blade returned to its sheath. He wasn't here for theater. He was here to bury the lie. Netanyahu slowly adjusted his tie, but the composure was cracking. For a man who'd built his legacy on dominance, being cornered by a younger, unflinching African leader was a disruption his handlers hadn't scripted for. And then, in a voice colder than steel, Netanyahu spoke again. "We fight Hamas," he said, low and deliberate. "Not children. Not innocents." Traoré blinked once, slowly. "Then why are they the ones buried?" His words dropped like stones in water, concentric circles of shame expanding outward. Across the chamber, screens flickered. More images. Not from journalists. From aid workers. From doctors. From satellite feeds. Children crushed under rubble in Khan Yunis. Tents burned in Rafah. Ambulances turned into tombs. Traoré raised his hand again. This time, not to pause the world, but to reveal it. "Your war," he said, scanning the rows of diplomats, "has no precision. Your bombs don't ask names. Your drones don't spare cribs." He pointed toward the Israeli delegation. "And you, who claims the right to decide peace or war, you already chose. You chose war when you broke the truce. You chose war when you called starvation a strategy. You chose war when you turned a border into a grave." Netanyahu's aides began shifting uncomfortably. One leaned in to whisper. He didn't move. He just stared, at Traoré, at the cameras, at history recording every second. From the balcony, a voice rose, young, clear, unafraid. "Free Gaza." Security tensed, but Traoré lifted a finger. "Not yet." He turned toward the balcony. "You don't need to silence them," he said calmly. "You need to hear them." And with that, the gallery erupted. Applause. Chants. Cheers. From students. From journalists. Even from a few stunned diplomats. Netanyahu's fists clenched on the table. He was losing the room, not just in words, but in truth. And Traoré knew it. He turned back to the assembly, voice steady as stone. "If you continue this war, don't ask who started it. Ask who refused to end it." The line would be replayed across every network within the hour. By the time Traoré sat down, the entire assembly had shifted. No longer a stage for rehearsed alliances and ceremonial nods, it had become an arena. And in that arena, Netanyahu, once the loudest voice, now sat surrounded by silence. He leaned forward, voice gritted with the cold fire of a man who felt his grip slipping. "You speak as if you know war," Netanyahu sneered, eyes narrow. "Africa has known chaos for decades. We survived. We built. We defend." Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, calm as the eye of a storm. "You built on bones," he replied. "And you defend with fire." A hush fell again. He rose from his seat, not to grandstand, but to bear witness. "Let me teach you something," he said, walking toward the center. "When you crush the weak and call it strength, when you bomb schools and call it self-defense, when you starve a people and call it strategy." He stopped, dead center. "You don't lead a nation. You haunt one." Gasps. A few murmurs. But no one dared interrupt. Netanyahu stood now too, as if rising to reclaim space. But the moment had shifted. Even his shadow felt small next to Traoré's presence. "We gave Hamas a chance for peace," Netanyahu snapped. "They answered with rockets." Traoré didn't blink. "You gave children tents and then dropped missiles on them." He turned to the delegates again. "And you," he said, sweeping the room, "you let it happen. With your funding. Your silence. Your concerns." A diplomat from Norway shifted awkwardly. France looked down. Even the U.S. ambassador, normally unreadable, leaned back, jaw clenched. And then Traoré dropped the hammer. "You treat Gaza like a stain. Something to scrub away. But the more you try, the deeper it sets in your history. You won't erase it. You'll only drown in it." Netanyahu stepped forward, fury painted across his face. But before he could speak, Traoré lifted his voice. Don't threaten Africa with your arrogance. We've seen what you call order. We buried it. We buried empires, too. The room trembled, not from volume, but from truth. Outside, protesters were gathering in numbers, holding images of Gaza, of Jenin, of Rafah. Holding flags, signs, hope. And inside, at the heart of global power, one voice was louder than all the bombs. Traoré. Traoré stepped onto the tarmac in Istanbul, greeted not by protocol, but by a sea of Turkish and Arab journalists. Questions rained like bullets, about Rafah, about Gaza, about the American silence. But he didn't flinch. He simply raised a hand and said, "Tonight, I speak for the dead." That night, beneath a domed hall gilded with Ottoman echoes, the Ankara Peace Summit convened. Qatar's foreign minister, silent but sharp-eyed, watched Traoré as he prepared to address the world. The stage was set, but there was tension in the air, a hidden fear that Netanyahu might sabotage even this. As the cameras rolled, Traoré stood alone behind the podium. He didn't read from paper. He didn't blink. "Ceasefires are not gifts," he began, voice calm, deliberate. "They are pauses in crimes." And Netanyahu, he broke even that. He slammed his hand down once, the sound echoing. "You ended the truce with bombs. You violated the silence with screams." Across the ocean, Netanyahu's office issued a statement mid-broadcast: "The IDF has targeted Hamas infrastructure. Any claims to the contrary are misinformation." But the timing only made things worse. Traoré raised a tablet, displaying footage. The screen behind him flickered to life, a hospital wing in Khan Yunis, mangled and burning, nurses carrying infants through clouds of smoke. "This is what you call infrastructure?" he asked. "Are babies your enemy?" The hall went silent. Even seasoned diplomats lowered their gaze. Then he turned his fire toward the United Nations. "Where were you when the bombs fell again? Drafting statements? Counting civilian corpses like columns in a spreadsheet?" His contempt was raw, unfiltered. "You have betrayed Gaza. You have betrayed every principle you swore to uphold." The applause didn't erupt, it built. From one corner of the room, then another, until even representatives from countries allied with Israel stood, unsure whether they were clapping out of conviction or fear of being on the wrong side of history. Outside, Turkish citizens held up signs: "Traoré speaks, the world listens." One simply read, "Kanla Bogula Kaksin, you will drown in blood." And at that very hour, Netanyahu received an encrypted message from Mossad: "Traoré's speech is going viral in Arabic, French, English, and even Hebrew. Control is slipping." The next morning, Tel Aviv awoke to something Netanyahu hadn't anticipated: silence, not from Gaza, but from Washington. There was no support statement, no press conference from the White House. No fiery defense on Fox News. Instead, Traoré's speech from Ankara had dominated every major global news outlet. CNN's headline read, "African President Shames the West Over Gaza." Al Jazeera aired it in full. Even BBC's most conservative analysts struggled to spin it. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu watched the replays with a clenched jaw, his advisors scrambling for damage control. "This will pass," one whispered. But Netanyahu wasn't so sure. Traoré had done more than condemn him, he'd exposed him. Meanwhile, Traoré was already on the move. He boarded a flight to Cairo at dawn. Egypt had remained publicly neutral, but privately furious, after the Rafah Gate bombing. Now, with Traoré's influence rising and Western credibility sinking, Cairo saw a new opportunity: realignment. The Egyptian president greeted Traoré with unusual formality. No red carpet. No empty pleasantries. Just a firm handshake and 4 words: "We've had enough, too." Behind closed doors, Traoré laid out a chilling possibility. "If Netanyahu continues," he said, "we will not wait for resolutions. We will organize airlifts. We will open corridors. And if that fails, we will arm the blockade. There was silence in the room. Egyptian generals exchanged looks. Not because they disagreed, but because they knew what it meant: confrontation. With Israel. With the West. With history. In Paris, Macron scrambled to catch up. "We urge restraint from all parties," he said in a monotone press release. But no one was listening. France sounded tired. Traoré sounded alive. And in the streets of Ramallah, something unexpected happened. Children chanted his name. Not Hamas. Not Fatah. But Traoré. They painted his face on walls. They carried handmade flags, Burkina Faso's flag, beside their own. For once, a leader wasn't talking in riddles or hiding behind diplomacy. He was calling blood by its name. And in Jerusalem, when Netanyahu received the latest reports, his hands trembled. He stared at his advisors. "Why him?" he muttered. "Because, Mr. Prime Minister," Traoré had answered fire with fury, and for the first time in years, the world wasn't afraid to listen. It was in Algiers, under a heavy desert sun, that the lines of the next chapter were drawn. Traoré arrived to a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the streets, not just waving flags, but holding signs that read, "No more blood for borders," and "Africa remembers Gaza." Inside the presidential palace, leaders from across North Africa waited, not out of obligation, but out of urgency. Algeria. Tunisia. Libya. Even Sudan sent a delegation. Some were cautious. Some skeptical. But all shared one grim realization: Netanyahu's war would not stay in Gaza. It would spread. Unless stopped. Traoré didn't begin with pleasantries. He walked to the center of the marble hall, looked each leader in the eye, and said, "If we do nothing, history will say we watched them die. I refuse." The room held its breath. Then came Algeria's president, voice low but resolute. "What do you propose?" Traoré laid it out in 5 points. 1. A unified African declaration condemning Netanyahu's strikes as war crimes. 2. An airlift of medical and food supplies directly into southern Gaza, regardless of Israeli objections. 3. Naval patrols in the Mediterranean to monitor and escort humanitarian ships blocked by the IDF. 4. Sanctions on companies profiting from the occupation, especially French and American arms manufacturers. 5. A call to the global South, from Brazil to Indonesia, to stand together, not behind old alliances, but new justice. It was bold. Maybe reckless. But it struck deep. Tunisia's envoy leaned forward. "They'll call this illegal." Traoré didn't blink. "Then let them. Colonialism was legal too." The room erupted, not in applause, but in awakening. The silence broke. Debate began. Some argued logistics, others legality. But none questioned why. That question had been buried in Gaza's rubble long ago. By the end of the day, a statement had been drafted. It was unsigned. But it was real. And more importantly, it was African. As night fell, Traoré stood on a balcony overlooking Algiers. His advisor, Diallo, joined him. "You realize what they'll say tomorrow, right?" Traoré nodded. "That I'm dangerous." Diallo smiled. "And?" Traoré turned toward the city lights and whispered. "Then it's working." The sun hadn't yet risen over Gaza when the sky cracked. Not from thunder. But from the whir of an American-built drone. It crossed into southern Gaza under the cover of darkness. Israel claimed it was targeting a known Hamas compound. But the compound turned out to be a UN aid distribution center. The blast leveled the building. 27 dead. 13 of them children. 4 were doctors. The rest, civilians waiting for medicine and rice. The world had seen many massacres by then. But this one felt different. Cameras were already there. International press. Red Crescent teams. The footage was broadcast in real time, raw and unedited, into every home with a screen. Traoré was mid-flight back to Ouagadougou when his military aide rushed down the aisle. No words. Just the video. He watched in silence. His jaw clenched. Then, slowly, he handed the tablet back. He wants war. Then let the world see his war. By the time Traoré's plane landed, #GazaBurns was trending globally. Protests erupted in Cape Town, Lagos, Jakarta, even Chicago. In Paris, students stormed the Israeli consulate. In Istanbul, a mass of angry citizens lit candles for the children, then torched photos of Netanyahu. But the reaction that mattered most didn't come from the streets. It came from the air. Hours after the strike, Egypt grounded an Israeli surveillance jet over Sinai. Then Algeria did something unthinkable: it shut its airspace to all Israeli-linked flights, including cargo suspected of carrying weapons. And Mali, one of Africa's poorest, still recovering from civil unrest, made the loudest statement. It cut all diplomatic ties with Israel. "We will not sit at a table with murderers," their interim president said. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré called an emergency press briefing. No podium. No teleprompter. Just a handheld mic in front of a wall painted with the word, justice. He spoke to the world, not as a president, but as a father. How many more must die before you call it what it is? This is not war. It is extermination. And if we stay silent, we are complicit. Africa will not be silent. A reporter shouted, "Is this a declaration of war against Israel?" Traoré stared into the camera. Calm. Cold. Clear. No. But it is a declaration of humanity. And if humanity is a threat to Netanyahu's war machine, then so be it. The feed cut. But the fire had spread. The Hague. A name that once echoed with justice, now whispered with hesitation. For decades, the International Criminal Court had danced around the crimes of powerful nations, condemning the weak, appeasing the strong. But Traoré's words had stirred something no diplomat expected: a global demand for accountability. Within 48 hours of his Gaza speech, Burkina Faso formally submitted a motion to the ICC, accusing Benjamin Netanyahu of war crimes. It was backed immediately by South Africa, Bolivia, Malaysia, and, shockingly, Norway. The legal language was sharp, unflinching. Deliberate targeting of civilians. Use of starvation as a weapon. Collective punishment in violation of Geneva Conventions. Netanyahu responded from Tel Aviv with mockery. "This is a circus act," he spat. "Let them try." Israel answers to no one. Traoré's reply came not through words, but through a flight manifest. He arrived in The Hague unannounced. No entourage. No security. Just one aide and a dossier thicker than a phone book. Inside were names, coordinates, satellite images, medical reports, and a USB drive of footage gathered by Red Crescent drones. Outside the courthouse, thousands had gathered. Arab mothers from Gaza. African youth from the diaspora. European activists holding cardboard signs that read, "The blood is on your robes." Traoré didn't walk up the steps. He climbed. Deliberately. Silently. Each step a defiance. Inside, the chief prosecutor met him with protocol. Traoré ignored it. He handed over the evidence and spoke only one sentence. "If this place still stands for justice, then prove it." Back in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu laughed in front of cameras. Africa can scream all it wants. It changes nothing. But something had changed. 10 countries suspended arms exports to Israel, citing pending investigation by the ICC. Two major energy firms, one French, one Brazilian, pulled out of joint projects in Israeli territory, fearing reputational risk. Even in Washington, cracks formed. A bipartisan group of senators demanded an immediate and independent review of U.S. military aid to Israel. Traoré was called many names: radical, agitator, naive. But across the global south, a different word emerged. Witness. He had shown up when others hid. And the courtroom that once silenced Africa now echoed with its roar. The vote was scheduled for midnight. The United Nations Security Council chamber was eerily quiet, its grand semicircle of flags casting long shadows across the polished floor. For days, diplomats had argued over a single, terrifying word: sanctions. Not on a rogue militia. Not on a weak regime. But on Israel itself. The resolution was historic. It condemned the bombing of Rafah, demanded the opening of humanitarian corridors, and called for an immediate cessation of hostilities. But more than that, it named names. And one name was at the center of it all: Netanyahu. America stalled. Britain hesitated. France blinked. And then Traoré entered. Not with a speech, but with silence. He stepped into the chamber, his eyes scanning every delegate, every nervous hand, every twitch of guilt hiding behind rehearsed neutrality. He didn't speak until every camera was on him. Then, with a voice like iron being dragged across stone, he said, "History will not ask which side you were on. It will ask, did you stand?" Some delegates turned away. Others held their breath. Traoré raised a folder above his head, this one thinner, but heavier in consequence. Testimonies from doctors who dug babies from rubble. Images of fathers carrying their children's remains in plastic bags. Coordinates of schools reduced to ash. And one final page, a list of the nations that sold the weapons. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply looked at each ambassador, one by one, and asked, "Is this your legacy?" When the vote came, the world watched. Russia abstained. China, yes. France, yes. United Kingdom, veto. Gasps echoed. All eyes turned to the U.S. representative, frozen, sweating, whispering to aides. And then, shock. The U.S. abstained. The resolution passed. Netanyahu's face wasn't shown on Israeli TV that night. But in Gaza, fireworks lit the sky, silent but defiant. In Ouagadougou, crowds danced through the night, chanting, "Africa will not kneel." And in New York, Traoré stood before 100 microphones and said, "We do not celebrate death. We honor the living by protecting them. You cannot erase what has been done. But you can end what is being done. This is not victory. This is justice beginning." The crowd didn't cheer. They wept. And as dawn broke over the East River, one truth stood taller than any flag. The world had changed. Because one man stood when others bowed.